Welcome. Thank you for joining us for Take Action Group, which is a partner program of our organization, the Epilepsy Foundation of Greater Los Angeles, and the Epilepsy Center of Excellence at the West Los Angeles VA Medical Center. My name is Rebecca Hollowell, and as the Assistant Director of the local Epilepsy Foundation. And on behalf of our partner and sponsor, we're excited to be offering this program to veterans with epilepsy and their loved ones, so you may learn how to better navigate the VA system and empower you with knowledge to aid you on your quest for seizure freedom. Today we have Dr. Christopher Lening from the Department of Neurology at the West Los Angeles VA. Dr. Lening will be discussing beyond medication, diet, surgery, and complementary alternative therapies. He will speak for the first 20 minutes, and you can follow along on the presentation by viewing the presentation online or visit veteransandepilepsy.org to access the PowerPoint. There will be an opportunity to ask Dr. Lening questions following the presentation, so please hold all questions until that time, and I will certainly let you know when to ask away. Following the Q&A portion, we encourage you to remain plugged in to participate in further discussion being led by Lorette Hayden. Lorette Hayden is a licensed marriage and family therapist with extensive familiarity with epilepsy. This discussion period will provide you the opportunity to have an open conversation with others affected by epilepsy, including loved ones and caregivers, to gain support and share information. Before we begin, I'd like to ask those who are in areas with loud background noises to mute their phones by pressing star 6. When you want to speak, all you need to do is just press that star 6 again, and you'll be unmuted. Lastly, just be aware that we are currently recording. Note that we are only recording the educational presentation, which we'll make available online for those unable to join us today. We will not be recording the Q&A or discussion periods. You'll hear a chime when the recording is concluded. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to you, Dr. Lening, to begin.
Thank you very much. Hi, my name is Chris Lening. I'm one of the epilepsy fellows here at the VA in West Los Angeles. And I rotate between here and UCLA, so we see a decent group of people between the two sites who have run into issues with medications, either taking several of them isn't enough to help with their seizures, or they have problems with the medications related to side effects, or just want to see if something else is out there. So I wanted to speak about the things you can do that aren't medications. Next slide. So I think the first place to start is to sort of frame it in terms of what we can do about seizures at this point in time. So the first thing we can do, which we do sometimes, is nothing. Some people have seizures very infrequently. Some people aren't that bothered by them. There's a certain condition that shows up in kids mostly that we just think will pass over time. And so with those people, we don't do anything. That's not usually what we do, though. So the first step we take is to try and change the brain chemistry. We do that with medications, which I know Sunita Durgalis had talked about previously, and we think that works something on the order of about 2/3 of the time. Also, some of the stuff that I'll talk about today, the ketogenic diet, some of the supplements are working kind of in that same realm, just not sort of as pharmacologically designed things. So the thing we can do outside of chemistry is to try and put things into your brain to try and stop seizures from happening, which are the Neurostimulator devices. All of those are options that we approach as things that will reduce the seizure burden rather than completely eliminate it. At times it can eliminate seizures completely, but we don't anticipate that happens typically. And so that includes the vagal nerve stimulator, the responsive neurostimulator, and the deep brain stimulator, or the VNS, the RNS, and the DBS. And the last thing we can do is we can try and take part of your brain away if we think that part of your brain is associated with where the seizures are coming from. we've found over time that this is the most effective way to stop seizures from happening when they can't be controlled any other way. The trick is that we have to find out exactly what part of your brain to take out, because there's a lot of it that we'd prefer to just keep where it is. So next slide. So before I get into everything, I'll mention just a brief caveat that when we talk about alternative therapies in particular, we can't always give a very clear or definitive answer. And so part of that is based on the fact that we don't know how a lot of diseases, including epilepsy, work exactly. We don't understand it to the exact level of, what's happening with cells and networks of cells and chemistry and all of that. We sometimes don't even know how the AEDs exactly work. There's a lot that work on a lot of different things at once, and we're not quite sure which of those is the thing that's the most useful. However, we do have the ability to do large trials of patients with specific treatments. It's slow, it's prone to some flaws, it's very expensive, but for what we have right now, this is the best way we have to identify effective and safe treatment options. We do this with the anti-epileptic drugs because the people who make the anti-epileptic drugs find that it's good for their financial interest to do these trials and demonstrate that their drugs are effective. For things that don't have quite the same potential profit margins, it's much, much, much harder to do those, and so we don't have those trials most of the time. Also from the trials, we know about the placebo effect, which is that pretty much any treatment you try, if you give someone a control substance, so something that we don't expect to be working, it's typically a sugar pill or something of that effect, anywhere from 10 to sometimes 30% of people in that sugar pill group will note that they've had a positive benefit from it. And so that suggests that there is some effect of perception. And it may be that you think that you're doing something actively, and that's what makes things better. And so with that, we'll see people who try something that's sort of outside the realm of what we know very well, and they'll report good success from it, and it's hard to say whether that's because that thing worked really well or because of the placebo effect. So I'll get into that a little bit later with some of the other stuff that I talk about. Next slide. So the first thing I'll start with is the ketogenic diet. This is actually because this is arguably the first thing that a doctor ever figured out to help reduce seizures. Back in the olden days, people noticed that if a patient was not being fed, that their seizure incidence seemed to go down. So the evolution of that is into the ketogenic diet, sort of similar to the Atkins diet, in that the emphasis is on removing carbohydrates in place of fat and to a certain degree protein. There's a few different ways of doing this. The traditional ketogenic diet is very, very strict. The modified Atkins is probably the least oppressive of the diets, but it still sort of puts a number on how many carbs you're allowed. Low glycemic indexes try and put all of your carbs into very high fiber sources rather than sort of simple sugary carbohydrates. And there's also medium chain triglycerides, or MCT oil, which are thought to be more inherently ketogenic than other kinds of oils or fats. And so you'll take that as something, sometimes like 50 or 60% of all of the calories you intake over the day will be this MCT oil. Next slide. So what we know about the ketogenic diet is that it does seem to work, and we've done sort of the large-scale trials on this. So sort of on average in the trials, the efficacy is something around 50% in reducing seizure frequency. Doesn't always mean complete seizure freedom, but at least means some significant dent is made in it. And there are certain genetic subtypes where it actually can be completely effective. Those are relatively rare. So people also tend to note, for the same reason that most people are on the Atkins diet, is that if you remove carbohydrates from your diet, you tend to lose weight. The ketogenic diet does work well with other anti-epileptic drugs that happen to remain on, with the exception of Topamax and Zonegran, topiramate and zonisamide, which can, in combination with the ketogenic diet, increase your risk of having kidney troubles. So we tend to stop those if we're going to try the ketogenic diet. But everything else typically can stay where it is. So the big downside of the ketogenic diet is that it's really hard to do. First of all, it's very expensive because you have to spend a lot of time finding and removing anything that might contain a stray carbohydrate from your diet. And so typically this requires the assistance of a nutritionist or a dietitian. And so you have to spend a lot of time planning your meals, measuring your meals. You have to time them out so that you don't get too hungry or sort of lose energy. The main side effects that people tend to note, the kidney stones, again, in particular, if Topamax or Zonegran happen to be also given concurrently, and a lot of people tend to note constipation. It's a very hard thing to keep up. For whatever reason, human beings really like carbohydrates. I know I do. They're delicious. Next slide. In terms of other diets, nothing has really been studied that extensively. There are some case reports of people who go gluten-free and will report that their seizures stop, but it seems like the common thread between all of the reports of success with a gluten-free diet and seizure freedom is that those people had celiac disease and so were actually gluten intolerant, which is the case for perhaps 1% of people. And so for the other 99% of people who would have seizures, going gluten-free probably doesn't do anything in particular. It makes some people feel better, but doesn't seem to do anything to the seizures themselves. Next slide. So the next topic is sort of straddling the line at the moment between alternative therapies and pharmacologic therapies, and that's cannabidiol or CBD. So there's about 100 cannabinoids in your typical strain of marijuana coming out of the ground. Obviously, the most important one is THC. It's the one that makes marijuana. It is not thought to be particularly helpful in epilepsy in sort of rat trials back in the day. Sometimes they would find that it would help with seizures, and sometimes they would find that it made seizures worse. Whereas with CBD, it seemed in the animal models to reliably make seizures better. CBD happens to be the second most common of the cannabinoids in marijuana and happens to be quite prominent in the current medical research because of its potential effects on epilepsy. So what we know is that cannabidiol doesn't actually seem to work in the same way that THC does. So there's specific cannabinoid receptors in the neurons in your brain, and that's what makes you high from marijuana, essentially. Cannabidiol doesn't actually seem to work on those. It works on a lot of other cellular receptors, but we don't actually know which one is the most important one or which one is the one that's associated with seizures and why it would help with seizures. So there's research ongoing into figuring out why it does something against seizures, but we don't actually know at this point. We do know that it doesn't actually seem to work the way the THC does. So a lot of the research has been in children with very severe epilepsy syndromes. That seems to be because it emerged anecdotally 5 or 10 years ago in children with very severe epilepsy syndromes. They would have sometimes dozens of seizures a day and were pretty much devastated by that. And so you would try every anti-epileptic medication you could think of and nothing would work. And so they tried this form of marijuana oil that was very rich in CBD, and it worked. And so they tried it in other people, and for some of those people it worked. Next slide. So anecdotally, we have a lot of reports of people who were unresponsive to everything until they tried CBD, and then it worked. We also have since had more reports of people who were unresponsive to everything, tried CBD, and it didn't work. And we don't really understand at this point what the difference between those two groups are. So for the early trials, again, only in kids with those very severe treatment-resistant types of epilepsy, there was some subset of the group that it seemed to help with, which is very promising because those are pretty much the hardest things to treat that we have in epilepsy. Those are the kids who don't get better from anything, and sometimes it'll only be 10 or 20 or 30%, but that 10 or 20 or 30% had previously not responded to anything. There was, however, some concern with those smaller trials, again, about that placebo effect because it was found in Colorado that a large number of the people who moved to Colorado specifically for this reported more success at relieving their epilepsy than people who just happened to live in Colorado. And so the thought was the people who moved there were much more invested in this working. And so when it did, that meant that it totally worked. And we don't know if that's the case or not. So we recently had a American Epilepsy Society meeting with a little bit more of the larger trial results that came out, and it seems to help with a certain type of seizure at least, but I think the full-on data from that trial still isn't out yet. We think it'll come out at some point in 2017. And in terms of adults with focal epilepsy, which is the majority of people that we would see at the VA, we still don't know. So there's not much we can say about it at this point, except it still seems promising. Next slide. So at the VA is federal property. Marijuana is a Schedule I drug. We can't prescribe it. However, if you happen to be in California, California has just legalized recreational marijuana, which includes CBD products, so it can be purchased over the counter. We can't be the ones to prescribe it or recommend it. I don't think that marijuana should be a Schedule I drug, but nonetheless it is. And so I am restricted by that. The one concern that we do have with recreational over-the-counter use is that we've found in other studies that there are a lot of things advertised as CBD-enriched oils that don't actually seem to have very much of it at all. And so there's not really a sort of regulatory agency on marijuana at the moment that ensures that when you buy something that's CBD oil, that it's really CBD oil and not just oil. Next slide. So complementary medicines, I'll touch on very briefly. So there really haven't been any herbal agents that have been fully studied thoroughly for the management of seizures. There are a handful that have animal studies that suggest they're efficacious. The one in particular that I'll mention is valerian root, which has some animal data to suggest that it's useful, and also sort of in terms of chemistry seems to be very similar in structure to valproate. I don't know if that also means that it has the same risk of side effects that valproate does, but we haven't really studied it. But of all of them, that's the one that I at least see the most plausible case for. Next slide. So nutritional supplements, to touch on briefly, melatonin might work in a rat model, but in human trials, they've all been small, and it only seems to help get you better sleep. However, when you get better sleep, that tends to help reduce seizures because you're not sleep deprived, so can't hurt. Magnesium we give to women who are eclamptic and have high blood pressure and can seize related to that. Otherwise, we don't really have any evidence that it's useful in any other type of seizure. And vitamin B6 or pyridoxine, there's a specific genetic type of epilepsy called pyridoxine-dependent epilepsy. It works fantastically well for that, and we've otherwise not found that it's useful in any other type of epilepsy. We do sometimes see that people who get irritable with Keppra will benefit from vitamin B6, and so we'll sometimes prescribe it for that reason. We also find that some people who get sort of tingly discomfort with Topamax will benefit from B vitamins, so you may see it for that as well. But in terms of actually working on the epilepsy, it doesn't seem to, except for that one group of genetic patients. Next slide. So in terms of alternative therapies, there have been some trials of various things. Acupuncture has been inconclusive. Biofeedback doesn't really seem to be useful. Yoga is inconclusive, and cognitive behavioral therapy is very effective in non-epileptic seizures, but its effect on epileptic seizures is less clear. However, we found that with especially things like acupuncture, yoga, cognitive behavioral therapy, that those seem to improve people's overall sense of well-being. And so from that perspective, we are fully in favor of those things if they have a benefit, even if that benefit isn't specifically in reducing your burden of seizures. Next slide. So neurostimulators. So we recommend neurostimulators when medication alone isn't effective or effective enough. And one of two things is the case. Either epilepsy surgery isn't an option, so people who have generalized seizures, people who have seizures coming from a lot of different areas of their brain, or people where surgery isn't a very good option because we think the seizures are coming from an area associated with movement or speech or memory, which are things that we don't want to remove surgically. And there's also a group of people who don't want to have part of their brain cut out, which is an entirely reasonable concern to have. So next slide. So the vagal nerve stimulator, you implant it in the chest, and it's a wire that connects to the vagal nerve going into your neck, which goes into your brainstem and goes up from there. The picture on the right shows one of the pathways that seems to be implied with its effect on seizures, but again, we're not 1,000% sure exactly what specific pathway it uses to reduce seizures. Next slide. So it sends electrical stimulation up the vagus nerve, which is the 10th cranial nerve, and runs down your neck. It's an intermittent stimulation. It's on for a few seconds, then off for seconds to hours. It also comes with a magnet that you can swipe against the battery pack on your chest for an on-demand stimulation if you are a person who has an aura of a seizure that will turn into something more severe later on. So if you note that aura, you can swipe the magnet, and sometimes people will have good success in preventing seizures from going further after that. So about 30 to 50% of the time, we think that there is a meaningful improvement in the frequency of your seizures. In terms of completely eliminating them, it's a small percentage. It's under 5%, but it's not zero. Next slide. So the benefit of VNS is that it, again, is effective, and it seems to be more effective over time. In terms of the neurostimulators, it is a surgery to get it put in, but there's no intracranial portion of that surgery, which people prefer VNS for over the DBS or the RNS. It does come with a risk. Your 10th cranial nerve is right next to the nerve that controls your vocal cords and your diaphragm, and so a lot of people will note hoarseness of voice, coughing. Rarely people will get paralysis of their vocal cords, but the hoarseness is in something like 20% of people sometimes. Next slide. So the responsive neurostimulator, you see the battery there, is actually underneath the skull, or sort of lying on top of the skull. They get shaved down a little bit, and since wires that extend into the brain, there can be either a strip electrode that wraps over the brain cortex or a depth electrode that goes into the brain cortex, and it sort of depends from case to case which of those it ends up being. Next slide. So we place either that strip or that electrode at the exact spot where seizures are coming from, but that requires that we know exactly where that is. And so that takes a more extensive workup of where the seizures are coming from than we need for a VNS, for example. So the benefit is that seizures that come from a specific focus tend to start at that focus and go for a very long time before they'll spread out further and cause clinical effects. And so if the device is able to identify that seizure starting at that specific point, it can respond with a targeted electric stimulation that prevents it from spreading any further. And so the seizures will still start at that focus, but they won't go further. So the initial trial that they did showed an even bigger improvement in terms of seizure reduction, over 50% of people with a significant reduction in seizures, and seizure freedom for about a 6-month period. They were noting in 16% of people, so about 1 in 6. In terms of, do they go years and years and years without seizures, where it's still pretty early on in the research phase of that, so we don't know exactly who is completely cleared of seizures by this. Next slide. So the benefit of the RNS is that it's our most precise target for seizures of the neurostimulators, and is the best option we have in people who have their seizures come from a place associated with their motor functions, with their speech, with their memory, which are places that we don't want to perform surgery on and take away. The seizure control, like with VNS, with RNS improves over time, so the longer you go, the better things seem to be. And we've also noted that the quality of life of people with an RNS implant seems to benefit, and it seems to depend on where it is. So people who we put it in the part of their temporal lobe associated with memory will note that they have improvements in memory, improvements in thinking. And so that tends to be where they note the benefit, but the overall quality of life improves. The downside is we're placing essentially a foreign body into the skull and into the brain. And so whenever we do that, there's a risk that that becomes infected, that becomes disrupted somehow. If there's a head injury, it can cause more significant damage. And so ultimately, there's also a group of people who we will put in a responsive neurostimulator in part to gather more information about the seizure type, which we can then use to guide a surgical decision, make it a little more targeted. Because ultimately we think that while RNS is very good, it's not as definitive as the epilepsy surgery itself. So the deep brain stimulator is similar to the VNS in that there's a battery pack that goes into your chest, but rather than the electrodes connecting to a nerve going through your neck, we actually put them into the part of your brain called the thalamus, the front part of your thalamus. So next slide. So we've done this very extensively for many years with great success in people with Parkinson's disease that's not responding well to medications. It is not currently FDA approved for use in epilepsy, but it is approved for use in epilepsy in Canada and in Europe with success, and we expect that the FDA will approve its use in epilepsy relatively soon. The reason it wasn't approved initially was because the trial that they did wasn't as impressive at 2 years post-implantation as it was at years 5 or 6. So we think, again, like with VNS, like with RNS, that over time the benefit improves and continues to accumulate. So in terms of how it works, again, it's very similar to what we do in Parkinson's disease. It's just we put it in a slightly different part of your brain than we do in Parkinson's disease. Next slide. So the benefits, it is a surgery that involves placing things into your brain, but unlike with RNS, we don't need to know quite as precisely where the seizures are coming from. There's also a suggestion that it may be beneficial in people with generalized epilepsies where we can't place an RNS. And the data shows a similar improvement over time to the other neurostimulators and a similar improvement in quality of life to the responsive neurostimulator, although there is a group of people who seem to have some depression symptoms, and I don't think we quite know yet whether the DBS is causing that, worsening that, or if that's just an unrelated thing. We're going to have to do a little more digging to figure out if that's the case. The downside of this is that it takes a special kind of exception at this point to get it done in the United States, and a similar risk as with the RNS of you're placing a foreign object into your brain, and so it can become infected, it can become painful, and the depression effect I mentioned. Next slide. So the final thing we'll do is surgery, which you can see the left is the pre-surgical, on the right is the post-surgical. We identified that portion you see on the left side was the area that was causing seizures, and identified that that was an area that, if removed, wasn't going to significantly worsen that person's quality of life, and so that makes the calculus pretty simple. If those two things are the case, then we will take out that part, and if the seizures all truly came from that area, we expect the seizures to stop. Next slide. So surgery is pretty straightforward. There's a bad thing in there, and we take it out. So epilepsy surgery is the consideration in anyone who has identified focal seizures, which basically means just not generalized seizures, who have failed 2 or more anti-seizure medications. It doesn't mean that we think that we're going to do this on everyone who has focal seizures and has failed 2 or more anti-seizure medications, but it means that that's at least an option for well down the line that some people will reach and some people won't. And we never really know that at the time we start that workup. Next slide. So the workup before an epilepsy surgery is pretty extensive. So we have to do imaging, the MRI and the PET scan to look for abnormalities there. We do a lot of EEG monitoring, both with surface electrodes like with routine EEGs, and sometimes with intracranially planted electrodes if the scalp EEG isn't telling us enough. We'll also do neuropsychological testing to see if there's a part of the brain that isn't working correctly at baseline, which further sort of suggests to us that it's the left side that seems off, the right side that seems off, the temporal lobe, the frontal lobe, the whichever. So we'll do those tests, the MRI, the PET, the EEG, and the neuropsychs in pretty much everyone. We'll sometimes add other tests. A functional MRI, we're usually doing at this point just to see what part of your brain is activated when you're doing language tasks, because we never want to take away those parts. Those parts are very valuable. We'll sometimes do a test called a MEG, or a magnetoencephalogram. It's similar to an EEG, except it's magnets instead of electricity, and helps us localize the issue in a different way. There isn't one in Los Angeles. There's one in San Francisco that we think is very good. There's one in San Diego that we think is a little less good, but is closer. So it'll happen at one of those two places. There's a SPECT scan, which is a special type of CT scan that also helps with localizing things that we see. And we'll sometimes do a test called a WADA test, where we inject a substance called amytal into one side of your brain to temporarily, for 3 to 5 minutes, knock it out and see what happens when we take away that part of your brain. Because essentially, it's sort of like a practice run for surgery. We're going to take out part of your brain just for a few minutes and see what you're able to do when that part of your brain is gone. So all of those tests may or may not be done before we're ready to say, the seizures are coming from here, let's take it out. So the benefits of surgery is that it's the most effective thing we can do to reduce seizures. And so after a year or two of observing people after observing people after surgery, we'll start to take away seizure medications, and some people can come all the way off seizure medications, and some people will stay on but at a lower dose or more tolerable dose. If we do our jobs very, very well, then the effect on people's quality of life is pretty minimal. We have people who have had this surgery who stopped having seizures and went back to work and seem to be doing okay. And so the thought is that the part of your brain that's causing seizures is not always particularly useful because it's spending so much of its time causing seizures that its sort of desired effect has been lost over time. So it's relatively expendable as much as any part of your brain is expendable. The downsides of surgery is that it's a major surgery. So even if we're very careful about planning, people will sometimes have permanent effects that last. We usually, in adults, will remove part of your temporal lobe, and because of that, there's often a bit of memory trouble that will result. And even with careful planning, we don't always have the ability to guarantee that that's where every seizure came from. So some people will still have seizures. They may be a little less. They may be a little different. But that's not what we hope to have happen, but we can't guarantee it. The quality of life measures in terms of how people are able to live their life, in some studies actually favors the neurostimulators, even though they don't take away the seizures completely, versus the surgery that can take away the seizures completely. We're not 100% sure why this is, but it seems to be the data that's shaking out. But some people, their quality of life is so ruined by having seizures that removing them is the best thing that we can do for them. So that is all of my prepared topics. I'm sorry, I realize I ran a little bit long. So any questions at this point?